Welcome to our lesson on loops in C++. In this lesson, we will cover the following topics. Number one, what are loops and why are they useful? Number two, we'll talk about the while loop. Number three, we'll talk about the for loop. Then we'll go on to the do while loop. And then number five, we'll talk about some tips for using loops effectively. And finally, we'll wrap our session up with what are loops and why are they useful. So let's get started. Let's define what loops are, first of all, and why are they useful. Loops are a fundamental programming concept that allow you to execute a block of code multiple times. This can be useful when you want to perform the same task multiple times, such as iterating through a list of items or repeating a process until a certain condition is met. Now, I wanted to say that this definition of loops is going to be common for any programming language that you use. It's not specific to C++, but I just wanted to give you a general definition before diving into the specific syntax for the different kinds of loops in C++.
All right, so the first type of loop we'll be going over is while loop. And this while loop is probably the simplest type of loop you can have in a programming language. So basically, a while loop is a control flow statement that executes a block of code repeatedly as long as a certain given condition is true. So the syntax for the while loop is as follows, and it'll be displayed to the screen. So we have while, and in parentheses, condition. So the condition will replace with some condition that we want. And then make sure that you have an open and close curly braces. And then in that is basically our code, where that code is going to be repeatedly executed as long as that condition is true. So here we're going to use an example of a while loop to print the numbers 1 to 10, right? So what we want to first start off is, by the start of the series, is we learn the basic C++ code. So first what we do is include IOStream library. So this should be review. We include the IOStream library, and then we do int main, where our program is going to run our main function. So int main, open and close curly braces. And now what we're going to do is set int I equals 1. Oh yeah, make sure to do using namespace std. So we're doing int I equals 1. And then what we're going to do is use the while loop. So while, and what we're trying to do is print from 1 to 10. So we're going to set a max to 10. So while I is less than or equal to 10. So as long as I is less than or equal to 10, we're going to print the numbers 1 to 10. So we're going to do is C out. So C out, and then a stream insertion operator, and then I. And then we're going to give ourselves a new line every single time. So end L. And then next, what we're going to do let's now go out of our while loop and return 0. And let's see what happens. So let's return 0 and let's run our code. Let's see what our output is. So it seems like we're not having any output. So what we're seeing here is we're going to see 1 being printed out forever. The reason for that is we're not incrementing our I variable, right? We're always staying at 1. And since our variable I is always going to stay at 1, the condition will never stop because 1 is always less than or equal to 10, right? So in order to fix that problem in our while loop, we need to increment our I 1 every single time. So I is going to print out 1, it's going to increment 1 once. So I 1 is going to become 2, which is then going to become 3, until it reaches the condition that I is less than or equal to 10. After 10 goes to 11, that while condition will be false. And that's the sign where the while loop is going to stop, right? So now let us run our code again. So there we are. We have printed the numbers 1 to 10 using a while loop. And so here it's important to note that if the condition is never met, the code block will never be executed. And this can result in an infinite loop, which you saw earlier with printing 1 repeatedly. And this can cause your program to crash or become unresponsive. So we want to make sure to avoid infinite loops. So that's the demonstration of a while loop. Now we're going to go on to for loops. So Pranav can carry on from here.
All right, so thank you for that. Let's go on to the for loop. This is another kind of loop. The for loop is a control flow statement that allows you to execute a block of code a specific number of times. Okay, so the syntax for the for loop will show here. So for, and then we have an initialization. Okay, I hope I'm spelling that right. Initialization. Okay, and then we have a semicolon condition, and then semicolon increment, and no semicolon after that. And then we have our block of code in between. So this is going to be code block to be executed. So this is our general format for the for loop. So for, and then we have initialization. So initializing a variable, for example, and then condition, which is basically like what we saw with the while loop, right? Similar to that, just a condition. And then we have the increment, basically like, okay, are we going to go plus plus, minus minus, times equals, whatever. You know, there's just so many different things. This can be increment, this can be decrement. It's basically we're changing the variables so that we actually have something that's occurring. If we don't change this variable that we initialize, then we'll always, and we meet the condition in the beginning, then what will happen is we'll just keep on going forever, and that's like another infinite situation. So we obviously don't want that to happen. So that's why we have to increment, decrement, or change our variable in some way. Okay, here's an example for of using a for loop to print the numbers 1 to 10. So it's pretty similar to our previous example, but in using a for loop. So I'm actually gonna go ahead and just comment this out. And okay, so again, we have hashtag include IO stream. This is a good practice using namespace std. And then what we can do is we can go int main. Okay, so for, now here inside, I'm saying int I equals 0. That's my initialization, so seen here. Then we have I is less than or equal to 10, because we want to go until 10, I plus plus. And then inside of that, we can go cout I and len. This will basically result in something like this, actually. Basically, printing out the first one and then going to the next line, and then so on and so forth.
One thing I want to mention is if you're printing from 1 to 10, we should say int I equals 1 instead of I equals 0.
Yes, that's a good catch. Okay, so what this would happen would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way until 10. Let me actually just go ahead and demonstrate that since I made that mistake. There you go. So that's what would happen. But since our prompt, I guess you could say, was to go from 1 to 10, we can go ahead and switch this to 1, and we'll get the appropriate result. Okay, so that basically will sum up our for loop discussion. Let's go into our final loop that we'll discuss in this video, the do while loop.
All right, so we are on to our last type of loop, do while loop. So basically, a do while loop is a control flow statement that is quite similar to the while loop, but it guarantees that the code block will be executed at least once. So the syntax for the do while loop is as follows. So do and open and close curly braces, and then after that curly brace, some code in that do, and then after the curly braces would be a while condition. So similar to how our while loop has a while condition, the while condition would come after our do, part of that do while loop. So this is how the format goes. So do, and then basically the open and close curly braces, and then after that we have while condition. So similar to our past examples, let's use a do while loop to print numbers 1 through 10. And as always, we start with hashtag include IOStream. And then int using namespace std. And then now we have our int main, which means program is gonna run this main. And then let's start off with int I equals 1, similar to our while loop example. And what we're gonna do is use do, and now we're gonna print out I. So cout I, and every time it prints out, it's gonna give us a new line, and then I plus plus, making sure to increment that. Now, keep in mind is that in a while loop, we have to do the incrementing in that while loop itself, but the for loop automatically has that increment feature. For while loop, however, it doesn't have the increment feature. So that's why in our while loop, we need to make sure that we have that I plus plus or I minus minus, depending on how we want to update our variable. And then now we have our while loop. So while, similar to our example for the for while loop for 1 through 10, we're just gonna have while I is less than or equal to 10. And now that should probably work. So let's try to run that. So we should see the output is the same. So as long as I is less than or equal to 10, it's going to go back to the do and print out I every single time. So one thing that I just mentioned before is that it's going to execute it at least once. So it's going to do the do at least once, and then it's going to, after that, check the condition for a while. And every time that while condition is true, it's going to go back to the do and print out I every single time until that while condition is false. So once I becomes 11, right, the entire do while loop will stop, much like how we saw in the while loop and for loop example. So this is our last type of loop, and let's now carry on to the tips for how we can use for loops effectively.
All right, so thank you for that explanation. Let's go ahead and sum up this entire video on loops in C++ with some tips for using loops effectively. So using the appropriate loop for the task at hand is something that's very important when thinking about which loop to use. So there's a bunch of options that we have discussed. We have, of course, while loop, we have do while loops, we have for loops, but exactly choosing which one is something that we have to keep in mind when going and using loops. Each type of loop has its own strengths and weaknesses, so choosing the right one should be the goal that you have in effectively building a program. And it honestly depends on the specific program that you're trying to develop, what kind of loop that you need. And so that's kind of a case-to-case basis. But in general, when you have a situation where you just have a condition that you need to meet and you don't have a set number of times that you have to run a program, then of course we can use a while loop. But when we have a set number of times in our head where we have to run our loop, then a for loop is something that's more appropriate. And of course, as Arnesh described very, very well, the do while loop is a situation similar to the while loop, but where we have like the first occurrence being ran and then we check the while loop. So it's like pretty similar, but different in a specific way. And there's also situations where the do while loop is is better to use than the while loop. So basically that concludes our discussion on in general loops in C++. I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you for watching.
Bye.